Even Mercer, a linguist known for his knack for decoding alien languages, stared at the grand hall with a mix of awe and dread. The towering alien figures around him shimmered with bioluminescent patterns that pulsed like a heartbeat. The Galactic Concord Assembly was known for its diplomatic dramas, but what unfolded before him was something far beyond his expectations. The Xynorian king, a towering figure with emerald-green scales and golden eyes, addressed the assembly. His voice was deep and reverberated like distant thunder. "Let it be known," he proclaimed, "that as punishment for my daughter Calris's transgressions, I entrust her to the care of this human." Even blinked. He couldn't have heard that correctly. A low murmur spread through the room, echoing off the crystalline walls. Some alien delegates exchanged glances. Others watched Even with expressions that ranged from pity to amusement. "Excuse me," Evan stammered, stepping forward. "Your Majesty, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm just a linguist. I negotiate translations and peace treaties. I don't raise rebellious alien royalty." The Xynorian king's golden eyes narrowed, and the room fell silent. "You are chosen because of your reputation for problem-solving and neutrality," he said. "Calris has dishonored our name by disrupting the Galactic Summit and breaking our sacred codes. Let her exile to your world teach her humility." Even opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, Calris entered the hall. She strode forward, her presence commanding and intimidating. Her skin shimmered with iridescent hues that shifted like storm clouds, and her sharp, angular features bore a perpetual expression of defiance. "Father," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "another one of your creative punishments. Shall I thank you for this little vacation?" The king's expression darkened. "Silence, Calris. Your arrogance has brought this upon you. You will remain on Earth until you learn the value of discipline." Calris folded her arms, clearly unimpressed, and turned her piercing gaze to Evan. "This is my warden?" she asked, a smirk tugging at her lips. "He doesn't look like he could last a day in Xynorian territory." Even flushed but stood his ground. "Look, I didn't sign up for this either. But if we're stuck together, we might as well figure out how to make this work." Calris raised an eyebrow, her smirk deepening. "Admirable. Let's see how long you last." Before Even could respond, the king motioned to the guards, who handed Even a glowing tablet. The device displayed an extensive set of rules and protocols for Calris's exile. "The terms are non-negotiable," the king said. "You are her custodian. Ensure she does not escape or cause harm, or Earth will bear the consequences." Even swallowed hard, realizing the weight of what he was being asked to do. Not only was he responsible for one of the galaxy's most notorious troublemakers, but humanity's standing in the Galactic Concord was also at stake. Hours later, Even found himself aboard a diplomatic shuttle, sitting across from Calris. The ship hummed softly as it drifted through hyperspace, leaving the bustling assembly behind. Calris lounged in her seat, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp and calculating. "You don't like this any more than I do," Even said, breaking the silence. "Perceptive," she replied. "But don't mistake my compliance for submission. I have no intention of staying on your primitive little planet longer than necessary." Even sighed. He could already tell this wasn't going to be easy. "Look, Calris, I'm not thrilled about this arrangement either. But if we cooperate, maybe we can make it bearable for both of us." She tilted her head, studying him like a predator sizing up its prey. "Cooperate? Is that what humans call surrender?" "No," Even replied firmly. "It's what we call surviving. Something I'm sure you're familiar with." Calris's smirk returned, but this time there was a hint of curiosity in her eyes. "We'll see, human. We'll see." As the shuttle descended toward Earth, Even couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. He was no soldier, no diplomat, just a man who loved unraveling the mysteries of alien languages. Now he was responsible for the most unpredictable challenge of his career: the rebellious daughter of an alien king. Even watched the Earth grow larger in the shuttle's viewport. He had no idea how he was going to manage this, but one thing was certain. It was going to be an adventure like no other. Even stepped off the shuttle, his boots making a soft thud against the smooth metal floor of the Earth-based facility. He glanced over at Caloris, who had been unusually quiet during the landing. She was seated on the opposite side of the shuttle, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Earth through the windows. The planet below was a vast blue and green orb, teeming with life and history. Even had always found it beautiful, but Caloris seemed unmoved by the sight. She had been raised on a world far different from Earth, a world of towering cities and alien technology. And it was clear she found Earth's simplicity beneath her. "So, this is your home," Caloris said, her voice dripping with disdain. "How quaint." Even sighed. He had known this was coming. Her attitude wasn't exactly unexpected. "It's not much, but we get by. You'll be living here for the foreseeable future, so you'll need to adjust." Caloris rolled her eyes. "Adjust? I have more important things to do than playing dress-up on your little mudball." Even felt the first real surge of frustration, but he kept his voice calm. "You're here because your father sent you here. This is not a vacation. If you want to make things easier for both of us, then we'll have to cooperate." She didn't respond, merely turning away with an air of complete disinterest. Evan's eyes narrowed. He wasn't going to back down. He had faced far more difficult situations than this. Diplomatic crises, cultural misunderstandings, even alien threats, but none had come close to the challenge of dealing with a hostile alien princess. The ride to the small town where Evan lived was long, and the silence between them grew heavier with each passing minute. Caloris sat with her arms folded tightly across her chest, her expression unreadable. Evan tried to make small talk, but she was having none of it. When they finally arrived, the car slowed to a stop outside a modest two-story house. It was far from the grandeur of Caloris's world, but it was comfortable. Evan stepped out of the car and stretched his legs, then looked back at her. "Here we are," he said, offering a slight smile. "This is home for now. You'll have your own room. There are rules to follow, so it's best if we get along." Caloris slowly emerged from the car, her eyes scanning the small house with clear disdain. "You live here?" she asked, her voice filled with a mix of disbelief and amusement. "I do," Evan replied, trying to keep the irritation out of his tone. "And you'll be staying here too. We'll figure things out, but there are some basics we need to go over." Caloris didn't respond immediately. She simply walked past him and entered the house, her every step filled with elegance, as though she was still the ruler of a kingdom. Evan followed her inside, mentally preparing himself for the difficult days ahead. Inside, the house was simple but clean. The living room had a couch, a few bookshelves, and a low coffee table, all surrounded by soft lighting. A small kitchen sat in the corner, and there was a staircase leading up to the second floor. Caloris stopped in the middle of the room and looked around with visible distaste. "I'm supposed to stay here?" she asked, her voice tinged with a mix of disbelief and mocking amusement. "This is beneath me." Evan couldn't hold back a smile. "It's not about luxury. It's about survival. Trust me, I've had my share of strange situations, but we're going to make this work, whether you like it or not." Caloris looked at him for a long moment, her golden eyes studying him carefully. Then she shrugged, her expression unreadable. "Very well, human. I'll stay. For now." Evan showed her to the room upstairs that had been prepared for her. The bed was simple, and there were no luxury amenities. The room was designed to be functional, not comfortable. Caloris eyed it with a critical gaze, but she said nothing. "You can rest for a while," Evan said. "We'll discuss things in the morning." As he left her room and descended the stairs, Evan's mind raced. He had no idea how to break through to Caloris. She was so different from the people he had worked with before, so proud, so set in her ways. He had to find a way to make her see reason. It wasn't just about keeping the peace, It was about survival for both of them. Caloris may have been exiled, but her father was still a threat. And if she was going to make it on Earth, she would have to learn to adapt, whether she wanted to or not. But what was even more troubling was her indifference. Caloris didn't care about the consequences of her actions or how her father had betrayed her. All she seemed to care about was her own pride. How could he, a mere human, make her see that there was more to life than power and domination? That night, as Evan sat in his small office working, a sudden sound from upstairs caught his attention. He stood up and moved toward the stairs, wondering what Caloris was doing. When he reached the top, he saw her standing by the window, staring out into the dark night. "Can't sleep?" Evan asked, his voice soft. Caloris didn't turn around. "It's hard to sleep when you're treated like a prisoner." Evan took a deep breath. "You're not a prisoner. You're here because of your actions. You brought this upon yourself." Caloris turned slowly, her eyes meeting his. "You think you understand? You think you can teach me something?" Evan didn't know how to answer. For a moment, the silence between them was thick, filled with tension. Finally, he said, "I think we both have a lot to learn. About each other, about survival, and about what it means to be part of something bigger than ourselves." Caloris didn't respond. She turned back to the window, lost in her own thoughts. Evan couldn't help but wonder if there was more to her than the arrogance and defiance she showed on the surface. Tomorrow, he would try again. He had to, for both their sakes. The following morning, Evan woke to the sound of footsteps downstairs. He had no doubt that Caloris was already up, most likely exploring the house with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. He had learned from the brief exchange the night before that her patience for anything less than grandeur was extremely thin. But if he was going to make this work, he had to find a way to bridge the gap between her world and his. Evan rubbed his eyes and stood up from the small desk where he'd spent most of the night planning their next steps. He was trying to prepare for everything, from teaching Caloris how to live on Earth, to making sure she didn't destroy anything valuable. He took a deep breath, then headed downstairs. Caloris was already sitting at the kitchen table when Evan walked in, her glowing eyes studying the contents of the fridge with a mixture of confusion and distaste. "What is this?" she asked, holding up a carton of milk like it was some kind of alien object. Evan smiled, trying to keep things light. "It's milk. You drink it or put it in your food." She stared at it, as though it was the most repulsive thing she'd ever seen. "You drink this? Liquid? From another species?" "Well, yes," Evan replied, chuckling softly. "Humans drink milk. It's good for us." Caloris wrinkled her nose but put the carton down. "I have no interest in your food. Where is the sustenance that matches my needs?" Evan sighed. It was clear that Caloris had no intention of adapting to Earth's simple cuisine. "I'll go to the market later and pick up some different things, but you'll need to try a few of our basic meals first. You can't live on your own if you don't eat what's available." She didn't respond, still looking unimpressed by the fridge contents. Evan decided not to push it for now. "So, Caloris," he began, trying to move past the awkward moment, "we need to talk about how things are going to work around here." "Do we?" she replied without turning to face him. "I have little interest in your petty concerns." Her dismissive tone made Evan pause. "Well, I have an interest in making sure we can both survive. If you refuse to follow some basic rules of Earth, like food and shelter, you won't last long." Caloris finally turned toward him, her expression hardening. "Do not lecture me, human. I've survived battles across the galaxy, against foes much stronger than you." Evan crossed his arms and met her glare. "If that's true, then I'm sure you can survive something as simple as food." She studied him for a moment before walking over to the table. "Fine. Teach me your ways, human. But know this, I will never be content here." Evan's patience was tested, but he knew this was only the beginning. He had to find a way to get through to her. The next few days were full of difficult, and often comical, moments. Caloris refused to eat most of the food Even bought from the market. She'd take a small bite of something, then recoil in disgust, claiming it wasn't fit for royalty. She refused to wear anything that wasn't appropriate to her royal standards, even though Even reminded her that she couldn't exactly get her alien garments from her home planet. But the most frustrating part of it all was her complete disinterest in anything remotely human. She would ignore the books Even tried to give her, dismissing them as childish tales, and when he invited her to go for walks or join him in simple activities, she would scoff. One afternoon, Evan tried to break the tension by showing her something he thought she might find interesting, a virtual reality headset. He had hoped that something interactive would catch her attention, something that wasn't just food or clothes. This, Even said, holding up the small device, is a way for humans to experience things outside of their physical world. You put it on, and it transports you to a different place. Virtual worlds, adventures, simulations. It's a good way to learn new things. Caloris eyed the device suspiciously. So it's not real? No, it's virtual, Even explained. It's not the same as reality, but it can be pretty close. You can experience things like flying, or even traveling to other planets, without leaving the room. She looked intrigued for a brief moment, but quickly pushed the thought aside. I have no need for your toys. I've seen planets and stars up close. What is a simulation to me? Evan felt his frustration mounting. It's about perspective, Caloris. You can see things from a new angle, even if you've already seen them in person. Sometimes, understanding something from a different point of view can be useful. She turned her back to him, looking out the window. I don't need a different perspective. I need a way to return to my home, to my rightful place. Evan's heart sank at her words. It was clear that Caloris still hadn't accepted her reality. She believed this exile was just a temporary setback, something that would end the moment her father decided to recall her. He knew that wasn't going to happen. If you want to go back home, Even said quietly, you'll have to find another way. Your father made it clear that this is your punishment. He's not going to call you back unless something drastic happens. Caloris spun around, her eyes narrowing. You think I don't know that? I'm not some lost child, human. I know exactly what I'm facing, but I won't let it break me. Even nodded slowly, seeing the pain beneath her tough exterior. I'm not asking you to break, Caloris. I'm asking you to adapt, to survive. Earth isn't the enemy here. Your pride is. Caloris said nothing, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Even knew he had hit a nerve, but it seemed like the first crack in her armor. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, Caloris could learn to accept her situation, if not for herself, then for her future. The days passed in a blur of challenges and small victories. Caloris was difficult, to say the least, but Even had learned something important. She wasn't truly indifferent. Beneath her arrogance and sharp words was a deep-seated frustration, one that had taken root from her exile. And perhaps Even thought, this wasn't just about survival anymore. Maybe it was about helping her find something worth living for on this strange planet. One evening, after yet another failed attempt at getting Caloris to try a new dish, Even sat down on the couch in his living room. He had to figure out a new approach. She wasn't going to simply adapt to Earth life. She was too proud for that. Caloris entered the room a few moments later, still looking as if the world had betrayed her. She glanced at Even, but didn't say anything. Caloris, Even said, his voice soft but firm, we need to talk. She didn't answer, but her posture was tense. She wasn't interested in talking, but Even wasn't going to back down. I know you don't want to be here, he continued, but you're stuck with me for now, and we both need to make the best of it. Caloris crossed her arms over her chest. And you think I'll just bow down to you because you say so? I will never accept my punishment. Even took a deep breath, resisting the urge to argue back. He had to get through to her, but that wasn't going to happen through force or threats. She needed to believe there was something worth learning here. I don't want you to bow down, Caloris, Even said. I just want you to stop fighting me at every turn. We've been at odds since you got here. But I know you're capable of more than this." Her golden eyes flicked to him for a moment, almost as if she was trying to see if he meant what he said. But then she turned away, her expression unreadable. "I don't need to prove anything to you, human." Even stood up, walking toward her slowly. "I never said you did, but I'm not just going to let you waste away here either." Caloris glared at him. "I'll survive." "I know you will," Even replied. "But surviving and living are two different things. You don't have to like it here, but you could at least try to make it bearable. And I'll help you. But you have to meet me halfway." For a long time, Caloris was silent, her eyes downcast. It was almost as if she was wrestling with herself. Finally, she spoke, though her voice was quieter than before. "Why do you care?" she asked. Even was caught off guard by the question. He had never really thought about it in those terms. He didn't have a personal stake in her exile, but somehow he felt responsible for making this work. "I care because we're both stuck in this situation," Even said. "And I don't believe it has to be miserable for either of us." Caloris didn't answer, but Even could see the flicker of something behind her eyes. He wasn't sure if it was hope, or maybe just curiosity. But it was a start. The following morning, something unexpected happened. Caloris came downstairs earlier than usual, and instead of the usual defiance, she seemed different. She wasn't smiling, but her usual scowl was absent. Even was surprised to see her sitting at the kitchen table, not with disdain, but with something resembling calm. "Can I help with breakfast?" she asked, her voice hesitant but polite. Even stared at her for a moment, unsure if he had heard her right. "Did you just say help?" Caloris's gaze hardened again, though not in anger. It was more like a challenge. "I'm not helpless. I've watched you cook for days. I can do the same." Even chuckled, though he wasn't sure whether to be amused or worried. "Well, I'll take that as a step in the right direction." Together, they prepared a simple meal of eggs, toast, and fruit. Caloris worked quietly, and though there was still an air of superiority about her, there was something different in the way she carried herself. It was as if she was finally seeing that Earth wasn't as beneath her as she had once thought. As they sat down to eat, the atmosphere was less tense than it had been. There was still no trust, but Even could sense a subtle shift. Caloris was starting to accept the reality of her situation. She wasn't happy about it, but she wasn't as openly hostile anymore, either. Even pushed a plate of food toward her. "I know it's not much, but it's a start. This is how Earth works. Simple meals, simple routines." Caloris eyed the food, her usual disinterest replaced by a flicker of curiosity. "I suppose it will do." They ate in silence for a few moments, but then Caloris spoke again. "I never expected you to care this much. I thought you were just another human with no understanding of what it's like to be a ruler." Even looked up, surprised. "I don't claim to understand what it's like to rule a planet, Caloris, but I do understand what it's like to be lost and out of place. I've been there myself." Caloris was silent for a moment. She looked at her plate, as if weighing his words. Finally, she spoke again, her voice softer than usual. "You're not so bad, human. For someone who has no power, you do know how to make things easier." Even smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment. "That's all I can do. Make it easier for both of us." The moment was small, but it meant something. For the first time since Caloris had arrived on Earth, they were working together, however reluctantly. And that was a start. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for Even, that was enough. As they finished breakfast, Even thought to himself that maybe, just maybe, they could make this partnership work. There was still much to be done, but for the first time, he felt like they were moving in the right direction. Weeks passed, and Even and Caloris settled into a fragile routine. Each day was a mix of small successes and inevitable setbacks. Caloris had started to accept Earth's way of life more than she cared to admit. She had even begun helping with the gardening outside, though her pride wouldn't let her show too much interest. Still, it was progress. Even couldn't help but notice the shift in her attitude. She wasn't as defiant as she had been in the beginning, though her sarcasm was still a constant companion. But there were moments, fleeting as they were, where she allowed herself to show some curiosity about Earth, about its people, and even about the simple joys of human life. One afternoon, as Evan sat at the kitchen table working, he heard a knock at the door. It was a neighbor, someone from the small town nearby. "Hey, Evan," the man called, a friendly smile on his face. "I was wondering if you had some time to help with the farm. There's some work to do on the crops, and I could use an extra hand." Evan glanced over at Kelris, who had just come into the room. She froze when she saw the neighbor. "Who's this?" she asked, her tone guarded. "Just a neighbor," Evan replied. "He's asking if I can help with some work on his farm." Kelris didn't respond, but she stood with her arms crossed, her posture one of resistance. Evan had no doubt that she didn't care for the idea of farm work or interacting with any of his neighbors. Her royal upbringing had left her accustomed to a life of luxury, not manual labor. "I could use the help, if you're free," the neighbor added, clearly trying to be friendly. "It's just some simple tasks, nothing too hard." Evan turned back to Kelris. "What do you think? You could come along if you want to get a feel for life here." Kelris eyed the man carefully, sizing him up. She didn't seem interested, but there was something in her gaze that lingered for a moment. She seemed to be considering his words. "I suppose I could watch," she said reluctantly, "but I will not get my hands dirty." Evan chuckled. "Fair enough. But you might learn something about this place, about the people here." The neighbor seemed oblivious to the tension between the two. He was a simple man who had grown up in the area, and he thought nothing of offering help. "Great. The work should be quick, and it'll give you a chance to get to know the town a little more." The farm was a short walk away from Evan's house, and as they approached, Kelris looked around with mild interest. The farm itself was nothing extraordinary, just a few fields, a couple of barns, and a small house on the property. Still, it was a far cry from the grand palaces and high-tech cities she was used to. The neighbor, whose name was Luke, led them to the field where he needed help. He handed Evan a small shovel. "We're just planting some new crops. Nothing too complicated." Kelris looked at the shovel like it was an alien artifact. "What exactly am I supposed to do with this?" she asked, her tone almost mocking. "You don't have to do anything, Kelris," Evan said, trying to keep the situation light. "You're just here to observe. We're not going to ask you to work." But Kelris wasn't the type to just stand around. She studied the shovel closely for a moment before taking it with an air of reluctant curiosity. "I'm not here to be idle," she muttered. Luke smiled, clearly pleased by her willingness, even if it was only a small step. "That's the spirit. Just follow along, and we'll get this done in no time." Kelris, clearly trying to maintain her dignity, started digging. Her movements were stiff at first, but she quickly fell into the rhythm of it. As they worked, Evan couldn't help but notice that Kelris wasn't complaining as much as she used to. In fact, she was working harder than he had expected. Luke chatted as they worked, telling them about the farm and the history of the area. Kelris listened in silence at first, but then something unexpected happened. She asked a question. "What made you choose farming?" she asked, her voice genuine despite the usual coldness. Luke paused, surprised that she was engaging. "Well, I guess it's in my blood. My family's been working this land for generations. There's something peaceful about it, something simple. I get to work with the earth, see the seasons change. It's just a way of life for me." Kelris stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You don't mind the hard work?" Luke smiled. "Not at all. It's part of the deal. You work hard, and you get to enjoy the fruits of your labor. It feels good to see things grow." Evan was surprised to see Kelris considering his words. He knew that her world had been nothing like this. For someone who had once been the center of a vast empire, the simplicity of farming must have seemed almost absurd. But there was something about the honesty of Luke's words that seemed to resonate with her. For the rest of the day, Caloris worked silently alongside them, her movements becoming less stiff as she learned the routine. She never said much, but even could see a shift in her demeanor. It was as though, for the first time, she was starting to appreciate something beyond power and control. As the sun began to set, they finished their work for the day. Luke thanked them for their help, and Caloris, to Ivan's surprise, actually nodded in return. "You may not have been entirely useless, human," she said with a small smirk, "though I still find this earth work beneath me." Ivan smiled back, feeling a sense of accomplishment. "It's a start, Caloris. A big one." As they walked back home, Ivan couldn't help but feel like they had crossed a threshold. Caloris had worked, and though she'd never admit it, she had enjoyed it, even if only a little. Maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to see the value in something simpler than ruling a planet. It wasn't the kind of progress he'd expected, but it was progress nonetheless, and that Ivan thought was a victory in itself. The following days after their trip to the farm were different. Caloris had an odd look in her eyes, one that seemed to indicate that something inside her had shifted. She wasn't as dismissive of Earth anymore, nor was she as eager to rush back to her former life. Maybe the manual labor had helped her understand that survival wasn't about luxury or status. It was about being able to adapt to new environments and circumstances. Ivan noticed the change in her attitude. She was still cold and proud, but now there was a touch of curiosity that had been missing before. She didn't always demand the finest meals or the most extravagant accommodations anymore, though she still refused to sleep on the floor. The small victories had been building up, and they were finally starting to show results. One afternoon, after a morning of working in the garden, Caloris came into the house, looking more contemplative than usual. She sat down across from Ivan at the kitchen table, her posture a little less rigid. "I need to ask you something," she said, her voice quieter than it had been in weeks. Ivan looked up from his work, surprised by her sudden change in tone. "What's on your mind?" Caloris hesitated for a moment, as though gathering the courage to speak. "How do you live like this? In this simplicity?" Her eyes swept over the small house, the plain furniture, the lack of grandeur. Ivan thought for a moment before responding. "It's about contentment, I suppose. We find joy in small things, a warm meal, a peaceful day, a little progress toward a goal. It's not always glamorous, but it's enough." Caloris looked away, her golden eyes far away, as she pondered his words. "In my world, there is always something to be gained, always something to prove." She sighed, as if frustrated with the thought. "But here, there is nothing. No throne, no crown, just nothing." Ivan leaned back in his chair, looking at her with a new understanding. "Maybe that's the problem, Caloris. You've spent your whole life looking for things to prove, but you don't need a crown to be important. Sometimes, it's just about finding value in what's around you, even in the smallest moments." She didn't respond at first, but he could see the gears turning in her mind. He had no idea if she fully understood him, but he hoped that the seeds of his words were starting to take root. The following week, as they continued their routine of working in the garden and tending to the house, Ivan noticed something new. Caloris had started to show more interest in the small projects around the house, learning how to fix a leaky faucet, helping him organize the spare room, even starting to decorate the walls with simple paintings she had done herself. One afternoon, Caloris was in the kitchen again, silently slicing vegetables for their dinner. Ivan entered, surprised to see her taking the initiative. She still wasn't talking much, but she was clearly working harder to contribute. "Did you need help with that?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. Caloris glanced up, her eyes hard, but not as cold as before. "I can handle it. I've had to learn how to do things myself since coming here." Ivan smiled, impressed. "You're starting to understand the value of these small things, aren't you?" She didn't answer, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of realization, perhaps. She was starting to see the strength that came from self-sufficiency and hard work. That strength was what people like Evan had relied on for years, even when they didn't have the luxury of power or privilege. Later that evening, as they sat down to eat, Caloris spoke again, her voice more thoughtful than usual. Maybe I underestimated this place. Earth, I mean. She glanced at Evan, as though waiting for him to react. Evan didn't want to seem too eager, so he simply nodded. It takes time, Caloris. But you're doing great. She didn't say anything more, but Evan noticed that the edge in her tone had softened. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was progress. A few days later, Evan had to leave town for a work-related matter. It was rare that he needed to leave, but when he did, Caloris was left to her own devices. He had come to trust her more, though he still made sure to leave her with things to do, like taking care of the garden or cleaning around the house. He couldn't be sure if she'd follow through, but he trusted that she was beginning to understand the importance of responsibility. When he returned later in the afternoon, he was surprised to find the house in better shape than he had left it. The garden was thriving, the dishes were done, and the small tasks he had left for Caloris were all completed. Caloris was sitting by the window, staring out at the landscape as though lost in thought. When she noticed him, she stood up and said, "I've been thinking." Evan raised an eyebrow, curious. "About what?" She glanced at the garden, then back at him. "You were right. It's not always about being a ruler. Sometimes it's about what you can do with what you have. And maybe Earth isn't so bad after all." Evan couldn't believe what he was hearing. The pride in Caloris's voice was still there, but it was no longer laced with bitterness or resentment. She wasn't giving up on her past, but she had started to accept that she could build something of her own here, even if it wasn't what she had imagined for herself. "I'm glad to hear that," Evan said, his voice genuine. "It's not about forgetting where you came from, but about figuring out where you're going next." Caloris nodded, though she didn't respond. There was still much she had to come to terms with, but Evan could see that the journey had already begun. It wasn't the path she had expected, but Caloris was starting to build a new future on Earth, a future she would never have chosen on her own. But now she was learning that sometimes life had a way of offering unexpected opportunities, and maybe, just maybe, this small corner of Earth would be the place where she would find a new sense of purpose. The months passed, and what had started as a reluctant partnership between Evan and Caloris had grown into something more. The progress had been slow but steady, and both had changed in ways they never could have predicted. Caloris had grown more comfortable with her life on Earth. Her sharp edges had softened, and while she was still proud and independent, she no longer carried the same bitterness in her eyes. She had learned to value the simple things: a good meal, the quiet moments spent working in the garden, and even the peacefulness that came from doing something useful. She had even developed a certain fondness for Earth's unpredictability. It was different from the cold, controlled life she had once known, but there was a certain beauty in that. Evan, too, had changed. He had learned to be patient with Caloris, to understand the struggles she faced as an outsider in a world so different from her own. Their conversations, once filled with tension and misunderstanding, had become more open, more genuine. It was as though they were learning to navigate the complexities of their own lives together. One evening, as the sun set behind the rolling hills outside their house, Caloris came into the living room holding a small piece of paper in her hand. Evan had been reading, but he looked up when he saw her. "Something on your mind?" he asked, noticing the way she was holding the paper like it was important. Caloris hesitated for a moment, then walked over to him and handed him the paper. It was a drawing, a sketch of their house, the garden, and the small farm they had started building together. It wasn't a masterpiece, but it was clearly her work. The lines were rough, but there was something sincere about it. "I've been practicing," she said quietly, her voice lacking its usual arrogance. Evan took the paper from her, surprised by the gesture. He studied the drawing for a moment, then looked up at her. It's really good, Calrus. You've got a talent for this. She nodded, though she didn't seem fully convinced. It's not like the art from my world. It's simple, but I think I like it. Even smiled. Sometimes the simplest things are the most meaningful. Calrus didn't respond right away, but she sat down beside him, her eyes still focused on the drawing. There was a long silence between them before she spoke again. I never thought I'd be here, she said, her voice softer than usual. I thought I would always be someone important, a ruler, a leader. But now, I'm just here, in this small house with you. Even raised an eyebrow. But he didn't interrupt. He had heard bits and pieces of Calrus's past, but she had never shared much about her life before coming to Earth. He had a feeling this was one of those rare moments where she was allowing herself to be vulnerable. It's strange, she continued. I thought I would hate this life, but it's not so bad. It's hard, yes, but it's real. And I'm starting to think that maybe this is what I needed all along. A place where I can just be me. Even set the drawing down on the table and turned to face her. I'm glad to hear that. I've always believed that we can all find something meaningful, even in the most unexpected places. Calrus looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment, before she spoke again. I never thanked you, for helping me adjust, for not giving up on me. Even was taken aback by the honesty in her voice. You don't have to thank me, Calrus. We're in this together. Calrus nodded, though there was a flicker of something else in her eyes. Maybe I've learned more from you than I care to admit. Even chuckled softly. I'm not sure I'm the best teacher, but I've learned a lot from you too. Calrus gave a small, almost reluctant smile. It wasn't a smile that he was used to seeing from her, a smile that hinted at warmth, understanding, and something deeper than mere pride. It was the kind of smile that spoke of change, of growth, of new beginnings. Later that night, as they sat outside on the porch, watching the stars appear in the sky, Calrus spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. Even, I never thought I'd have a future like this. I thought my life was set in stone. But maybe it was always meant to change. Even leaned back in his chair, gazing up at the stars as well. Life has a funny way of doing that. We think we know where we're going, but sometimes the path we take leads us somewhere we never expected. Calrus nodded slowly. I used to think that Earth was beneath me, but now I see it differently. It's not about power or status. It's about the choices we make, the lives we touch, and the connections we build. Even smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. They were both growing, both adapting, and perhaps in their own way, they were both beginning to heal from the past that had shaped them. We all need to find our place, Calrus, he said, his voice thoughtful. And sometimes we find it in the most unexpected places. As the night grew darker, they sat in silence, the sound of crickets filling the air around them. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, Calrus felt like she was ready to face it. She had once been a queen in a faraway land, but now she was someone else, someone who had learned to find value in the simple joys of life, someone who had found a new purpose. And as she sat there beside Even, she realized that this, right here, was where she was meant to be. Not in the past, not in the grand halls of her former home, but in this small corner of Earth where she could finally be free to live a life of her own choosing. It wasn't the future she had imagined, but it was the future she was ready to embrace. And for the first time in a long while, Calrus felt a sense of peace.